Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
This is the second weirdest morning of my work with Anonymous. Was this? This is, if you've never seen it before, the Polish Parliament. Now, if you started off with 4chan and hacker culture and so on and so forth, and somewhere along the lines of your professional journey, you're staring at this. So what I'm going to be talking about is kind of Anonymous in context, how it interacts with the outer world, how it interacts with the media, and how it interacts with other organizations. And so, like I say, this is the second weirdest moment of this. But to give you a little bit of my background in this, I am from the beautiful city of Los Angeles originally. I think of this as like a picture of my childhood in summary. And one of the things about Los Angeles is every 10 to 20 years we like to have a few riots and shoot brown people and that sort of thing. It's kind of a tradition where I'm from. And that's a pretty normal thing in Los Angeles. It's kind of hideous. But last time that happened, we're going to have to, let's see, now we're getting, I'm just going to search on Google. And I need a browser. Everything works different from my computer. Now, I went through the LA riots. It was a formative moment in my teenage years. And I got to see how other people were going through very, very similar things. Like I say, these things just happen in Los Angeles periodically because we just don't deal with them very well.
Hi, what's your name?
And I did tune in to the Anaheim riots with the interest of seeing, the latest disaster in my hometown. And I was forwarded this video.
The police started shooting rubber bullets and they ended up hitting you?
Yeah.
Can you tell me, like, from your side of the story, like, what was going on during that time?
I just saw, like...
That's the weirdest moment. So somehow it had gotten all the way from 4chan to the Polish Parliament to the... to the... now I have to remember what the PowerPoint icon looks like. Yes? Okay. Now we've made this full trip all the way back to the completely understood and known and like incredibly non-technical race and class wars of my hometown. And this face of dissent has now transited the whole circle there and then come back. And what this is from, this image, is actually from the anti-ACTA protests across Europe. And the ACTA story is an interesting one in that there were a bunch of us who were, I kind of shade over into activism more on the copyright side. From journalism, so I write about that a lot. And I had been writing about ACTA and how completely horrible it was for years, as had many people in the NGO space and so on and so forth, and we were making exactly the normal sort of no progress one makes. But something had changed earlier this year, and that change had been SOPA PIPA, when the internet rose up and destroyed a bad law. And now it was happening in Europe. And from 0 to 60, from nothing, from a few NGOs desperately trying to get something out. It started in Poland. It went from there, and it covered probably upwards around 300,000 people over 200 cities in Europe. And ACTA went down. And the people who did that, were taking up some of the iconography and the values and the images and so on and so forth of Anonymous. And so the question that one has to ask when you ask about Anonymous in context is, were they Anons? It's not an easy question to answer. Do the people who take up the iconography for a day, are they then Anons? Are they Anons for the day? Are they false flag? So on and so forth. When people talk about false flag operations, that implies somewhere that there is a true flag. Honestly, I don't know exactly the answer to that. Anonymous is of a species of entities that is coming kind of the network collectives, the feral network collectives I've talked about. And this is actually some graffiti from Egypt from the time of the revolution. And of course, it's a huge army of pawns and a knocked over king. And it's a wonderful summary of the way Anonymous functions, but it's also a summary of how these species that it interacts with, species of networked organisms that it interacts with, also function. And sometimes this works better than other times. Also heavily involved with the Arab Spring, Anonymous, not necessarily effectively, but it was incredibly catalyzing for Anonymous, and they tried to keep comms alive, and they tried to get information in and out of countries that were in revolution. And when Mubarak I was in Channel in Egypt when Mubarak shut off the internet, and the existential cry that echoed across the internet that day when the Anons realized you could just shut them off has changed their character. Of course, they were incredibly involved with Occupy. They were the tech support for Occupy. They're one of the main reasons Occupy was able to spread around its different cities. This was my moment of realization that there was that there was no true hard-line distinction between Occupy and Anonymous. Was the top 1% why you pay no taxes sign, which is like about 3 levels of wonderful meme deep, and right next to Code Pink too, like just right there. Now, Anonymous doesn't have leaders, but it has heroes. As a matter of fact, I don't think it functions very well without heroes. And this is, again, one of the places where it interfaces with outside culture. So this is Mohammed Bouazizi, and he became a rallying cry, not just for the Arab Spring, but also for Anonymous. Of course, right now, and this is a bit awkward for me, they have a new hero. And in many ways, Aaron, who, if you don't know, was tremendously close to me, is a fairly perfect Anonymous hero with his pirate hat and his EFF shirt. And he was also persecuted by law enforcement. He was setting up for internet freedom. Like, you couldn't design a better saint for Anonymous. And in fact, they went ahead and attacked MIT and put up a message there in support of him, and started something called Op Angel to run ops in support of Aaron and his goals. Now, one of the things that Anon told me when I was talking to them about this particular thing was that on the one hand, many people are very emotional and anonymous about what happened to Aaron, and on the other hand, this was the time they could, going back to the, because you never get away from the lulz. This is the one time they could hack MIT without repercussions. So that transits really well into the fact that this is an incredibly weird postmodern landscape. Smoked. So when you're trying to kind of talk about where it intersects with media and with the greater narrative, this gets really weird. Like, postmodernism is like the start. You know, you need your Deleuze and Guattari to get through the kindergarten of understanding this shit. And for me, you know, it's just one more moment of, I've been covering these guys for a while, and suddenly they're having, you know, Op my best friend, and it's just one more moment of strangeness covering Anonymous. And, you know, I drop in and talk to them about it, but because this is how weird the world is now. I'm just reporting in from how weird the rest of your lives are going to be before too long. But what I discovered in trying to cover these guys, these fearsome internet creatures, is that you have to tell the story. If you're going to talk about them or understand them, you have to tell the story of how you came to believe the story that you're telling. And that means that you are always part of the story. You can't escape that. If you're going to understand these strange stochastic things, you join them. You don't necessarily join the disposition of any one thing in it, but you can't not participate. So I would love to say, as Josh says, that I am not now, nor have I ever been anonymous, but I think they kind of press-ganged me into their media narrative, and so I make them and they make me. I can try to keep that separate, but I think it's more valuable to you, my former audience, to expose what's happening to me and let you, also get press-ganged into the story from the moment that you start to kind of participate in the reading and the comprehending and the speaking. You can't talk on the internet without in some way being related to Anonymous at this point, because they're a creature of internet speech. So, a few tips if you ever find that you want to actually try and write about Anonymous. One of which is that you need to have a sense of humor. And also you need to not... one of the terrible things that journalists and activists and people inside of organizations do is communicate that they are in some way afraid of Anonymous. Let's make something clear. Anonymous is not actually very scary. And they're not very tough. and they're kind of fun a lot of the time, as long as you can kind of let their rhetoric bounce off you. But just kind of acting scared of Anonymous accomplishes nothing, whereas trolling them gets you respect. So when I started my coverage, I went ahead and made my own little. So this is a little bit older. This is the interior landscape of the dangerous collective, and you'll notice off here the ICANN has cheeseburger spur. And a lot of this is still kind of describing the same stuff that was on that flowchart, but I just scrawled it on a piece of paper. And but I think it's really, really important to have that area where there's a great cone called Birth of the Moral Fags. And that is like where we start to get interested in Anonymous, because most of us, in fact, in the world are moral fags. It's an interesting history. I'm going to roll on. We have to understand when we're covering these people that, when you're talking to these people, anytime you talk to people, you raise their risk. So I, for instance, ended up designing my coverage around making sure that nothing I could have on my computer was actually in any way endangering my sources. I wouldn't take down nicks. I wouldn't log anything. And then I would make that public because, again, going back to the first point, this is all within a context, which is oppressive law enforcement. So I designed everything around making sure that oppressive law enforcement had no use for me whatsoever. And I'm happy to say that since I started anonymous coverage for Wired, I have not been subpoenaed. Anyway. Harmless things in aggregate can become dangerous, and dangerous things in aggregate stay dangerous. It's not a safe world. We have this illusion that things became dangerous at 9/11, and that cracks me up because I remember the Cold War, when we weren't really going to plan for the world because we were all going to end in a nuclear holocaust, and 9/11 made things dangerous. But the world's always been dangerous. Give it up. Life's dangerous, and death rate is still holding at 100%. So you might as well live a little before you get there. And the people in Anonymous and in many of these collectives do this because they're disempowered. And one of the things they're disempowered by is safety culture. And many people in this room, we wouldn't find many Anons in this room because the people in this room tend to feel empowered in their lives, which is, means that you can use those methods and you're not tempted to join one of these collectives. But these collectives are full of people who are that infinite well of solitude that each individual is, finding a way of taking action. And that is dangerous, but it's interesting. So a little bit about, like a little, bouncing around a little bit, but a little bit about how they hack the media. My favorite operation is Operation Facebook, which is mainly at this point relaunched every few months to see which media is gullible enough to report on it. Anonymous is never going to take down Facebook. They're going to take down whichever media organizations are going to say that they're going to take down Facebook. And they reverse a lot of conventional things about media and narrative and so on and so forth. So for instance, when they do the big video announcing they're going to take down Facebook, or they're going to do this or that or so on and so forth, that is essentially the point where somebody anonymous is saying, hey, I'd like to talk about this. Usually by the big announcement in our world, that means that all the talking has been done, the logistics have been sorted, there's been some forms filled out, funding has been secured, so on and so forth. In anonymous, that means let's have a conversation. And then you go to the back rooms of IRC channels and strange little spots on the internet and figure out if people really want to do it. And at that point, it either hits a critical mass or it doesn't, and it can go latent or die altogether. But at that point, there's a quiet thing in the background that actually makes the decision. And journalists would regularly call me and say, I found a video, does it mean it's going to happen? And I'd say, well, okay, it's not that simple. It's not a false flag or a true flag. It's a proposal. And so to find out if it's really going to happen, you're going to have to go look in these particular IRC channels and get to know people. And they're like, lady, I am on a deadline. So it fucks with media narrative. Also, media narratives are all about finding the person in charge, putting a long title next to their name, and then you know something is true. This is more of a job of finding the feeling in a room and hoping you've got it right. And accepting, and this is again why it's so important to tell the story of how you came to believe the story that you're telling. Because that's data that is very, very important for understanding what's actually happening in the world. This is just here because I really like it. Anyway, that's my anon in context.
Announcements are proposals, and one, sort of, if there's a set of perspectives across the board, whether that seems correct-ish or is a version of something correct, and two, if there's a relationship between that and the fact that the net is run on things called requests for comment. Right?
So I would say the majority of times it is. There's a few instances where it's TINC, there is no cabal, but there's a group of people who decide to take action. I think the Op Mega Upload is a good example where a bunch of people who had access to botnets sort of just charged ahead. But in many, many instances, it is a proposal and you hope it sticks. And so it's very similar in that regard.
Yeah, that first part, maybe Josh can speak to the second part. The first part I would say, yeah, how does a meme explode? There's millions and millions of these things, and as soon as they're kind of set out there, some of them catch on, and that's kind of watching how these things form with an anonymous is a little like that. It's hard to predict. Lots of possibilities, lots of announcements, and some of them just catch fire. And I don't know the science behind that, but it's interesting to watch.
So, sideways answer, I guess. Part of what you saw is part of the blog series I did called Building a Better Anonymous with a co-author. And what we wrote, some of them hated the idea, but we said something similar, which is not formalizing something with RFCs, but that mantra of measure twice, cut once, or do fewer things better. And we started to inject those kinds of ideas that when you're that mob think, group think, spontaneous, tactical, you're really prone to manipulation. You're really prone to distraction. It's a lot of sound and fury, so there's a lot of bombastic activity, but maybe not lasting impact for your true grievance that motivated you in the first place. And it wasn't to judge them, it was saying you have a number of options, and some of these will require more strategy more focus, tighter teams, and they do this through operations, but it's sideways answer. It's a complex group.
What about the comment?
I will say I mostly agree with myself on that, but but it's an interesting on the you have those groups that kind of run and make an announcement. Often they don't make an announcement; they just run and do things. But also, like to build on what Josh was saying, you do have this system where it's easy to manipulate, but it's impossible to capture. Because you think manipulation leads to capture, but you just can't keep anonymous on topic long enough to technically capture them. So yeah, you end up being able to throw these things out there. But one of my questions, going back to kind of the first thing that arose from me, was like, if you're trying to manipulate the hive and your day job is at the FBI, are you actually an infiltrator, or have you just joined anonymous? And, I feel like one of the metaphors I used early on is like, if this is what this thing is, and there's all these jurisdictions and all these law enforcement in these rooms, and they're acting like anons until they get to something that violates something in their jurisdiction, are they just anonymous? But so my quick metaphor for that is, if you move to California and you get a job in California and you dress like a Californian and marry Californian and eat Californian food, have you infiltrated Californian, or are you just a Californian?
Bruce Sterling, I love his hacker crackdown, and it's probably a good time to reread it right now. But he's always like, the line between the FBI and hackers, is a blurry line. They're very similar. It's a kind of funhouse mirror inversion. They do very similar things. And it is certainly the case that I do think the FBI can further the agenda. And it's true, it's very hard to capture, in part because there's also these new budding formations, new IRC channels that boom, emerge and take off. But man, hackers will often say, the law enforcement, they're not very funny. They don't have a lot of lulls. That's maybe what prevents them from becoming anonymous.
Well,
So I'm curious about, in some ways we live in a society in which there are all kinds of people who think all kinds of laws are unjust. And you can pick any law, and there's some group of people who, so there are people who think the fact that stores get to keep their merchandise and everybody can't have it, there's some people who think that's unjust. There's some people who think we should be able to mistreat women. There's some people who think any number of things. And then we have these laws, and we debate and do whatever we do, however imperfectly, to get those laws. And I wonder why, it seems to me in this space, there's a tolerance for what, in some cases, is simple law breaking, in the name of, this is kind of Rosa Parks-ish, rather than this. And I wonder, do all of you think, clearly there's, in all the presentations there was some rhetoric of this is the new Rosa Parks, and there's some rhetoric that these are just people breaking the law. How do you guys come down on that question? I didn't hear a lot about the rule of law, which we still have and operate.
Yeah. Everybody here can do it. Maybe I'll just take a quick stab. The denial of service attacks are a really interesting example that I think hit right at what the nuance of this discussion. Denial of service attacks aren't breaking in. They're just, everybody knows what, they're taking down a site, overwhelming them with packets and fake information. That's a neutral tool. That's not something that should just be uncritically embraced, right? This is something that, one competitive business will do to their competitors to try to shut them down. This is something attacks we've seen on WikiLeaks. We've seen it on Freedom of the Press Foundation, a new thing that just started. They've been attacked by denial of service attacks. Telecomics was hit by them. NGOs have been hit by denial of service attacks by governments that don't like what they're doing. So, denial of service attacks have been used in awful ways all across the board. In some cases, they've been used, in the case of denial of service attacks against PayPal, MasterCard, and Visa, they were used as what you could consider to be a kind of protected First Amendment activity. This is a mass group of people saying, we don't like you, we don't like what you did. It's clearly a protest, and not that should be legal, but the kind of punishments we're seeing are huge. 15 years per case and $250,000. I mean, shutting down a street corner is illegal too, but you get a night in prison and $250 fine. So I think that my case would be, and I can tell everybody else has a view on this too, but is that the nuance of that discussion is completely lost. This is all, everybody gets lumped into hackers. It's the unknown. It's fearful. We're seeing huge kind of fishing expeditions and big punishments for things that might be considered First Amendment activity.
So, first of all, I'm going to question or challenge Josh, which we do quite a bit, but that's one of the reasons why I brought him here. I actually don't see a lot of chaotic actors who are trying to burn shit down and be evil. I've interviewed about 50 people in depth, mostly on IRC, and a good handful in person. And first of all, what is freaking amazing about Anonymous, like sociologically astounding, is that because of the pseudo-anonymity, you have really different types of people who come together. I'm talking about upstanding, young college students at the best schools of Europe, to those who are hackers in the hood like Sabu, to those on the margins, to those on the center, those who are Buddhist, those who are libertarian, those who are anti-capitalist, those who are social democrat. Some believe in laws, some don't. You have a multitude. It truly is a multitude. But it seems to me, for at least the political networks, Vox, Anon, Anon-Ops, which are sociological realities, people there are there for activism. And they're willing to use a diverse number of tactics that not everyone will agree upon. There can't be consensus. But to sort of portray it as, even like the majority, and I don't even see that many who are just there to raise hell. And what's also interesting, and maybe you guys can speak to this because I find this fascinating, there haven't been pure trolling attacks under the name of Anonymous in a couple of years as well. They are irreverent, they are uncivil, and they will use the full range of legal, illegal, and morally, ambiguous tactics. But people there seem, from my perspective as an anthropologist, to be there for activism.
One real quick thing, in doing many, many, many interviews, and I didn't count, of people, the two most common reasons, the two reoccurring reasons that I get why you joined Anonymous. One, for the lulz, to do something funny, and two, because I have children. Because I feel there is no future, and I have children.
That's true. One of the Anonymous 16 is a middle-aged housewife from Napa Valley. I met her, 2 kids. Josh had a picture of a bunch, if you remember, a bunch of hackers that had been arrested, all the mug shots. That's the Anonymous 16 arrested primarily for denial of service attacks against PayPal, MasterCard, and the one I mentioned about WikiLeaks. The one that was actually in the middle was a mid-40s housewife from Napa Valley, not technically literate by most standards, but 2 kids, same as what you just said.
I'm going to try to pivot from what you said to her challenge to me. First off, I wrote that before I even started the research. And as an observer, there was some very aggressive, over-the-top behavior. Now that we know more, it wasn't typical of Anonymous. But now that there's been much more knowledge about Jeremy Hammond, for example, he was one of the more aggressive guys. He was one of the ones with a clear ideology. So one of my disappointments... Activist ideology.
Not just to watch.
And not even common. So, a simple and amateur trick is if we exclude women from the room, this is an all-male conference, right? So we tend to exclude certain examples. As an observer, people were afraid. I think you used the word used, that people were afraid, a lot more afraid of Anonymous, personally. There was a period where journalists weren't attacked. And then there was a period where a few journalists were attacked. So it wasn't clear. It looked very random and chaotic. And that's where some of that fear earlier came from. Or Frontline, Brian Krebs. And they weren't necessarily done by the real Anonymous folks. All right, regardless, we can get in a rat hole. What frustrates me, having watched this for so long, is I think the real questions are what gave birth, what are the drivers, what's fueling the feeling that we don't trust rule of law, we don't trust government, we are opting out of normal ways to be angry. I'm much more interested in what is fueling this because it's fascinating and terrifying than is it or isn't it free speech. So let's just wave a magic wand. DDoS becomes free speech. 3 years from now, it's not a felony anymore. I'm okay with that kind of line of argument. And we can differentiate old AntiSec argument from new AntiSec argument. And we can decide who really was or wasn't illegal or the joker. I want to have all those conversations quickly and sufficiently and put them to bed so we can actually talk about large groups of people are post-national, their families and their tribes are virtual, they are participating directly, they don't trust rule of law, they don't participate in local norms. The basic building blocks of social contracts are rule of law, nationalism, family structure, Judeo-Christian belief, or religious text. All of those factors are eroded or eroding. And that's the fascinating question. So I'm not frustrated with my fellow researchers. I want to accelerate what we're doing so we can get to the real underlying questions.
I want to go out on a limb here and say something in support of Josh, which is that I do actually think that there is still an element of burn it all down inside of Anonymous, but in the same way that the activism had to kind of clothe itself in nihilism to get started, right now the kind of like Op Hunt Hunter and just like the really crazy Op Hunt Hunter was this this thing to go after this guy who does well, no, he was like a porn revenge site and so on and so forth. And it was pretty clear talking to the people that were doing that they were that they wanted to go after someone. And like you could clothe this in now you clothe your nihilism in activism to get some support in Anonymous instead of clothing your activism in nihilism. There are still some really, really bad asshats in Anonymous who just want to fuck shit up. But you know, I mean, their role, you know, and this takes me back to this kind of like, and I think another place where I support what Josh is saying is in when I say this is a new species. This is a thing that is upon the earth. Their role, even the shit kickers in Anonymous, is very similar to, say, the ultras in Tunisia and Egypt, who essentially football clubs that may or may not have a political agenda, but they really like fighting the police, which turned out to be a useful skill set when you had protests going on. So the fact that you have some burn it all down types isn't necessarily going to mean that Anonymous tends to burn it all down, but it does mean that you end up with this kind of like, you end up with a vanguard that's willing to train the others and do things others aren't willing to do.
Had maps and charts up which suggested sort of increasing nucleation and subdividing. In anybody's view, do you think that subdividing played out 18 months, 2 years results in dissipation or in greater network strength? How does that? Yes. Right. I mean, right. It could be. Sort of what does that dynamic look like?
Yeah. It's a good question.
So. If there's fragmentation and nucleation, which there certainly is, so long as there's shared skills, capacities, and ideologies, and this is where its iconography is so important and so strong, it creates some, unity in the face of that fragmentation. But, I am always like, when are they going to go away? Because it's so fragmented, it comes and it goes. And, I've been so surprised already at how long they've lasted, precisely for the reasons you've pointed out.
Anybody else on that?
Very short. I mean, I do speculate on this, and one of the reasons I talk about the blog as a dialectic is we started off saying we believe half of what we're asserting here is probably wrong. So please debate, but, friendly debate, hopefully, or intense, but let's talk about it. We have a belief that if you separate the identity meme and the convenience, there's a very low barrier to entry, but an upper bounds level of impact for that identity meme. And for those craving more, there's nothing stopping them from forming groups. There are tons of hacker groups that predate Anonymous. Some of them are very clandestine and highly impactful. And yet, so there can be both, right? I think you'll see groups specialize, have shorter rosters, tighter trust networks, and the identity meme.
I want to say something on this too, if you don't mind. On our film's website, we did a thing called the Hacktivist Timeline, which was almost as much work as the actual film itself. So check it out if you want. It's a kind of tracing of this kind of activity back as far as we could trace it. And it might start with actually Stephen Levy's book or something, or no, it starts with Guy Fawkes actually. But anyway, it's clear that there have been groups. There has been this kind of anger and this kind of activism, similar kinds of activity that we're seeing now throughout history. And sometimes that has led to really legitimate groups splintering off, people that are not attracted to the more extreme elements but find some grain of truth in the gist of the activism. And I think that, EFF, you could say that some of these things have come out of those kinds of more extreme activity. And one group that Quinn is involved with now, apparently, is telecomics. Telecomics is really, really interesting and really, really similar to Anonymous in some ways, but different in it. Sometimes they say, we build things. Anonymous tears things down, we build things. I've heard Pete say that. In any case, here's a group that's sort of attempting that, to try to break away with some sympathies, but it's trying to break away. So if I have a hope, I think I would love to see more of that kind of stuff, taking some of those kinds of principles and moving on.
I just want to quickly challenge the frame of the question, though. Our whole societal structure has been hierarchical. It's been structured. It fits into Gantt charts. This is more like, and we look for centers of things. And I've often said this is like nature. Where's the center of nature? But I mean, like, when you're trying to understand this, think of it as a weather front. Don't think of it as an organization. And I think you do better to take it out of the social frames that you're used to, because these things are many, many autonomous cells that, through communication and coordination, ad hoc coordination, create something larger than themselves, which is, again, why I like to go to slime mold for this. Slime molds and weather fronts. And then the question becomes less coherent, but more interesting.
So, wait, I'm tying it off real fast. If you look at the complex challenges like internet freedom and the ITU, they DDoSed the Wicket conference. That will not prevent the regulation. And some of them know that. The ones that have really, really read and studied and scrutinized with law backgrounds, all the language in the legislation, they know it's going to take a longer campaign, multiple channels, working through official channels, former channels. You won't stop that simply with a day-long op. So there will be certain challenges for which it is perfectly suited, and there'll be certain challenges which will require other adjacent surgical efforts.
Let's keep our eyes on our civil liberties when all this happens. Yeah.
Maybe had a question?
I'm just trying to reconcile my picture sociologically of who tends to get enlisted in this, because I'm hearing conflicting things. One, that it's primarily people who don't have other means for voice and power. So I think, Quinn, you put it nicely. Nobody in this room is going to really be an anon because we have other, because we're empowered. But then I'm also hearing things about it being a very diverse coalition that includes people in sort of mainstream institutions. And so I'm just trying to understand what the hell is going on in terms of participants.
I mean, I don't know. There's two extremely important people who are part of the 1%. Someone who's very visible. I'm not even going to say where. And one of those is in the workforce. Another one is a 16-year-old. There's those who are extremely disempowered. There are those who were part of the hacker underground in the 90s and are like fucking psyched that you can hack again in this kind of political way. Lots of males, lots of people with no technical skills. But I would just say I've been astounded by the full range. But in the end, that kind of desire for sociological quantification is impossible. And I've just gathered these flashes, these glimpses from the people I've met in person and the interviews, which I kind of have to trust the people, but in the end, I can't even verify it.
What's your gut?
I mean, my gut is it's diverse, not so much with gender, but with sexuality and economic background. And it's a function in part, there's this great quote by Naomi Klein, which I don't know by heart, but it's about Che Guevara, which is like, Che for Palestinians mean this, Che for, Americans means this. A masked entity, and in Anonymous, there's not even that Che person, it's just anonymous. And so people can identify in very different ways. That said, if you're involved in internet geeky things, 4chan, blogging, hacking, you're more likely to end up in Anonymous. But that pool of people is already quite diverse as well.
Real quick to clarify something I was saying, it's the feeling of being powerless. And it's sometimes, I shouldn't say everybody in this room, but, and sometimes people in positions of power still feel trapped by their situations, such that that feeling of powerlessness and the feeling that you can go become this other person and be empowered. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if there's people in high-level positions that have occasionally gone into Anonymous where they can really feel like they can express the empowerment that they actually want, as opposed to the one that their role puts on them.
About, for the sociological reasons, I'm curious what you guys see is, do you feel like hacker people getting involved are doing it because initially that they find a community and then there's the political reasons that come out of it? Because what I see, I always explain, for the equivalent in China would be the human flesh search, where it's like everyone from all walks of life, a lot like we were talking about, which is like government officials will also be involved in giving up information because they don't feel comfortable doing it publicly, but a lot of times they're getting involved because they see it as like these are their friends and they're doing these, and then the political stuff comes out of it. So I'm curious, through your close interactions with these communities, what are their initial reasons for becoming a part of this collective?
So in the Chinology network, they protested the Church of Scientology. They're actually the least anonymous of the nodes because they protest in person. And certain cities, New York in particular, like tight-knit friends, and they themselves will say, we kind of came together as friends, but we've continued to fight the Church of Scientology. One of the fascinating things about the more illegal networks, or where there's illegal activity, even if a small portion are only breaking the law, is that actually friendship is very hard to form because you can't necessarily meet people. And this is very different from the other hacker communities I study, where it's precisely friendships and dedication to the craft and dedication to the idea of free speech, which creates the conditions for hypersociality. So in my writing... Fellow nons, people do become friends, but it's under considerable duress sometimes. And they get really bummed out about the fact that they must hide themselves. And in fact, one of the reasons why I think a lot of people were willing to meet me when I went to different cities was I was like flesh and blood person from the internet that they could meet. And so it's a very different dynamic from most other hacker circles where that friendship is so important to their kind of, way of life.
The dynamic changes too. The culture changes with different ops, right? So before Scientology, there was a certain group of people, and then those people protest Scientology, and people that just don't like Scientology notice the protests, say, wow, this is an anti-Scientology group, love to be a part of that. So the overall dynamic shifts and changes with each sort of cause.
Are there mechanisms for self-regulation, and how do those work?
Which is don't seek attention for yourself, right? And so AntiSec in particular, because LulzSec, and Quinn has written really well about this, on the one hand, they declared, we're not anonymous, we're not anonymous, we're not anonymous. The media just collapsed the two, and many of the individuals came from Anonymous, and there was so much overlap that it was very hard to differentiate. But one of the things that was interesting was they became rock stars. And then when they became AntiSec, on the one hand, they were beloved for their political work or the potential political work, and freaking hated because they were working under the banner of a name, AntiSec, and people really started to dislike those, status-seeking fags. And so that kind of very, very strong ethic against celebrity is one way to regulate themselves internally.
The other one that's really, really important and key is that if you're going to have, and you start with 4chan, but also every time Anonymous takes up a new cause, it gains a whole bunch of new members from that particular, there's a bunch of, Middle Eastern Anons now because Anonymous was involved with the Arab Spring. So you end up swelling the ranks with, and again, going back to Chinology, the ranks were swelled by the existing anti-Scientology people as well. But so how, there's an interesting mechanism that's evolved that is this, one of the other core values, which is just offensive humor. And I realized, participating in these spaces, that that the way you get cultures from all around the world to play nice and coordinate things is not by making sure nobody ever says anything offensive, but by making sure that everything is always offensive. And there's no distinguishing between offending someone along cultural lines because we're in an explicitly offensive space. So that kind of, the trolling culture actually short circuits much of the the difficult work of the 20th century, trying to get multicultural groups to work together. They just managed to get away from that by saying, look, everyone's going to be offended all the time. We're gonna even out the temperature by putting everything at boiling all the time, and it works. There are many different schisms in Anonymous, but they're very rarely about local cultural issues. So that they kind of it's constantly offensive and it's internet culture driven, and without that level of offense, the space would actually be much more emotionally hurtful.
Can I just say one thing? I've been informed that Moose 22 thing I gave you may have just run out. I made a new one, SCS 2013 for download. Or potentially. I'm fine with that too.
That we should finish, but I want to thank again the Cabal for coming out of the smoky back room and sharing today. Thank you very much.